Hey guys, hello and welcome to another video of Power Automate. Hope you're doing great with your practice going well in Power Automate. So in previous video, we have added some items to the queue and we have also called a text of flow from another text of flow. We have learned how can we call a text of flow from another text of flow. So today we'll be seeing how can we process the queue items, right? So if you remember, we have this file, right? And today I have added two columns in here to be processed and processing notes. Right, so if you remember what we have done in previous video is we have put the processing notes as a status column, right? The status column goes into the processing notes, and in here I have made some status as blank, and I have also removed some invoice IDs from this file, right? If you can see, only some are removed and some status is blank, and I have added two columns in here, right? So what we will be doing in this video So what we will be doing in this video is we will be using all these items. We have seen add work queue items. Today we'll see how can we use process work queue item, how can we use update, how can we use requeue items, and how can we update the processing notes. Okay, so for this I have done some changes into the file. I will share you this file in the description box, or you can change it as you like. I'll tell you the logic, what logic we will be applying today. So if in status column, if the status is paid, right, then we have to put the status of work queue item as business exception, right? So if I apply filter, if I go with the paid, okay, so here we have the business exception and the processing notes must be invoice already paid, right? Okay, now next is if the status is invoiced, okay, then where the invoice ID is present, we have to put generic exception that it is being invoiced, okay, and processing notes must be paid, right? If the invoice ID is blank, status is invoice, then we have to put the work queue item as IT exception, and we have to put the ID as blank in processing notes. Okay, so and if it is the status is uninvoiced, then what we have to do is we have to set the status in the work queue as processed, and we have to update processing notes as processing amount, and then we have to pick this amount. Okay, and if the status is blank, okay, then we have to put the status processing timeout and status is blank, right? Also what we can do, you can apply your own logic. Let's say if a status is blank, you can just expire your items or delay your items or anything you can do with the work queue. So I suggest you to go and play around with the work queue items, see what it can be done, how you can change and update these files, how can you update the status. I have just taken a simple example to explain you what can be done, right? So also there is one more question I wanted to ask you guys is, let's say I have changed the status column, the k column to status, and if you see G, this is also status, and in K this is also status. So let me know in the comment section below, if I add this data into the work queue, will it give me exception that column G and column K are the similar, have similar column names? So will it add the item to the queue? Will it throw the exception? Just let's try this out on your own and let me know in the comment section below. Right, for now I will just rename it to the status. Okay, so let's get started. Let's delete old items from our work queue and let's add these items, and let us not add these nodes for now. This is for our reference what we have to put in the work queue status. Okay, so let's get started. Let us delete the items. So we'll be deleting the items. Let me just go to work queue and okay, work queue. Let me just delete this queue only and create a new one. Okay. Okay, now I have a process called process work queue item, and in this I have a add to queue process which will add the data into the queue, right? So in this I have done just one change where I have applied an exception handling to add items to the queue. So in this process, I have only done one change to, if there is any exception while adding the item to the queue, it should go to the next stage. That's the only change I have done. So I have called this into this add to queue. Now, in order to now process queue item, so it will ask me. So here we have taken the queue name, and here let's just rename it as work queue item only. Okay, let's see. Now this queue item will come in the JSON format, right? And we have to convert that JSON into our custom object so that it will be easy for us to read it, right? So we will just, so this value will be in JSON format. I'll show you how that looks. Data item. Okay, let me just quickly run this and I will show you how this one looks. Save and run it. So it has added the items, and let me just run this process work queue item. So if you see in here and in the value, it is in the form of JSON, and if I convert this JSON into custom object, then it will look like this, right? So if I want to get the value for work queue item ID, I'll just give this. For invoice ID, I'll give this. For account name, I will give this, right? So this is how this will look. And if I go to my work queue and just refresh it, here I have the 30 items. If you see, 29 are in queue and one is processing, right? Okay, so now let's build a logic to update the work queue items, right? So if I go and open my file, so this is the file we have. As I explained earlier, we have business exception, process timeout, generic exception, ID, and process. So first logic we'll apply is if the invoice ID is blank and status is invoice, then it would be ID exception, and processing notes would be ID. ID is blank. Right now, if invoice ID is available and status is paid, it would be a business exception. Similarly, if invoice ID is there and status is blank, then it would be a processing timeout. And if it is invoiced and invoice ID is present, it would be a generic exception. Processing note is paid. Else it is uninvoiced, it will be processed and processing amount. And processing notes will be processed amount, and the amount will be picked dynamically. Right. So for this, you can build your own logic. I'll be using a switch statement for this, although you can make it a bit shorter. So I have made a subflow, which is process item scenario, and there is one more exception handling. So in process item scenario, I'll be making some scenarios where if there is a business exception or there is any exception, I'll be assigning a variable value. I'll show you how this will be done. So I'll first use an if. So if the invoice ID is blank, right? If you have watched my earlier video, this is how we give the null character in Power Automate. So if it is blank, invoice ID is blank, right? So first step is we have checked invoice ID blank, and then we'll check status, right? As status is invoiced, right? So we'll use one more if, okay, and we will use data item, and this is how we give the value, right? So this will be a this scenario would be an IT exception. ID is blank, right? So let me just assign a quickly a variable. So this is scenario one, where the during scenario one, the it is a ID is blank and it is a IT exception, right? Let me just add a comment also. Okay, now we have done this. Now if invoice ID is not blank and status is paid, right, then it would be a business exception. Okay, so let me just add one more elif. here. So invoice ID is not blank, and status is it, right? Then it will come under scenario 2. So here we can write it as business exception scenario 2, and we will assign the value as 2 in here. Right now, if a status is blank, then it will be a processing timeout. So it will be scenario 3. So let me just copy this. So for blank, we have this expression, and it will be scenario 3. It will be a timeout. Right, then we have our scenario 4, in which we have the generic exception, and if status is invoiced, right, and this is not blank. So this is similar to this, the status is invoiced, right, but invoice ID is not blank, right? So it's just simple. For this is generic exception, and this is the last, if status is uninvoiced, I hope the value is correct, then it will be scenario 5 as processed. Okay, so for each scenario, I have assigned a variable. Like for scenario 1, values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 scenarios. I have assigned 5 values, right? As simple as that. And in exception handling, let's say if there is any exception during our flow, right? So we will mark that item. We have to mark that item as exception also. So meanwhile, I'm doing the exception handling. I'll just want to share this, that if what is the difference between different types of exception here. So IT exception is basically when you have a application and it is not able to log in, right? Or you have an application, it has some latency issue, it comes under the IT exception. Business exception is basically which are the rules which are defined by business and bot needs not to process that. Those comes under business exception. And generic exception is basically when you have incorrect input file and ops needs to correct that input file, that comes under the this a generic exception. Now processing time out is basically when the let's say the SLA for a process for an item is 1 hour, but while processing the items, the time process. So you can mark that item as processing timeout, right? So this is how we handle these exceptions. This is how the exceptions are defined. Now we have converted this into our JSON format. Let me just quickly use a switch. I'm using switch. You can build your own logic for this. I'm using switch since I have not explained in any of the video the working of switch. I will be going with the switch here quickly. I'll just take a switch and define the value into the switch. So here I made a case where if it is into case 1, then if you remember case 1, it was IT exception, I guess. Let me just quickly check this. Right, it is a IT exception and the processing nodes is IT is blank. So you can also define a variable in here only for processing nodes. I'll just giving my processing nodes in here, right? So similarly we'll have 5 cases, right? I will just quickly copy paste all the cases. This is second, third, fourth, fifth, right? So for case 2, we have the business exception, right? I think the business exception is invoice already paid, right? And in third, I think we have the processing timeout, yes. And for timeout, the status is blank. So this is just an example that how we update the work queue items. You can build your own logic, and I'll be making a full project end to end where we'll use queue, where we'll use exception handling, and where we'll also see how things work, how we mark the exceptions, right? So in generic, we'll say that it is paid, and then it is last, or we can just define it as the default case also, right? So here I'll use a default case where item will be processed and processing nodes will be processing amount, and amount will be picked dynamically from data item amount. Okay, and if there is any exception during the processing, right? So it is always recommended to not to follow the happy path always. We always have chances of exception, so I'm just making an exception block. Okay, go to beginning of the block, save, and I will just have this into my all the data into my block, right? So this. Okay, just to quickly recap this, we have added a add to queue where it will add items to the queue. If items are already there, this will not add the items into the queue. Now on block error, we have, if there is any error, we will just simply call our workflow, which is exception handling. And in exception handling, we have marked the item as exception, right? IT exception with the error, last error, right? Now process work queue item, it will have convert the JSON into custom. Then we have the switch, where for we have defined different scenarios, and in the default one it will mark the item as processed, right? So let me just quickly go in here, and there is one processing item. Let me just put it into the queue. Okay, change queue status. If you see queued is read out, so I'll just mark it as IT, and then again mark it as queue. So this is the cheat sheet for it. This is how you can mark the processing item as queued. All right, so let me go back and remove this, save, and run it. Okay, so now I just run this. Till the time it is running, I just wanted to tell this to you that you can build your own logic to mark these cases of exception. You can have a web application design where if there is any if there is any latency, you can mark it as IT exception. And if there is you have to define some rules for business, and that rule does not match, then it is a business exception. There is issue in the input file with particular that queue item, that it will be generic exception, or else it will be marked as process. And it's a best practice to always update the processing notes. Okay, it is completed, and if I see and refresh it, all three items are processed, but they should not be. Because this is because we have not called this process item scenario in our process work queue item. So let me just quickly call this subflow also. So because we have not called this subflow, the items are going into the default stage. So process item scenario, let me just save it, and meanwhile let me clear the queue. Right now it is saved. Let me close it quickly, and let's run it from here. So process flow item is running. Let's see. I think it will first add the items to the queue. Okay, added 4 items. 9. Okay, let it run. So we have just got this process queue item completed. Now let's see. Let me just refresh this. Now first let's check for the processed one, and 18, 23, 26, 29. So if I go with the processed 18, 23, 26, 29, processing amount is 4232. Let's check for this one only. Let's check the processing nodes. Okay, this one is correct, and it will also show you the duration, how how much time it took to complete this. It will show you the username, unique ID, and all that, and the process duration. It will also show you the input which is available, right? So we have 4 processed item, which is correct. Let me check the processing timeout. There are 4 items with processing timeout. Let me quickly check the input file I have. Right, so 4 items are here. So status is blank. If I go in here, status is blank, and if I go to the input, see, the status is blank. Right, similarly, if I go into the generic exceptions, then we have 10 generic exception, we have 3 IT exception, and 9 business exception. So this is how we can mark these items as exception, and we can see the statuses in the work queue, right? So this is all about the process work queue item. We also have some other actions. So there is only one action left, I think, requeue item with delay. I will see how can we use that action in our real project. So this is all about the how can we use queue, how can we add item to the queue. Thank you for watching. Happy automation. See you in the next video. Bye.